Welcome to the second part of today's episode on Sarajevo Haggadah. We're joined now by Dr. Hikmet Karcic, who is a genocide scholar based in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He is a researcher at the Institute for Islamic Tradition of Bosniaks. He's a senior fellow with the Center for Global Policy in DC. He was the 2017 Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation Keene State College Global Fellow. And as well, he is the author of the annual European Islamophobia report for Bosnia and Herzegovina. His research is focused on genocide and Holocaust studies, Islamophobia, memory studies, and extremism. And most recently, he published a book, a biography of Dervis Korkut, the man whom we mentioned in the first part of the podcast and who saved the Sarajevo Haggadah in World War II. Hi, Hikmet, and first, welcome to Dignified Resilience. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for the invite.
Sure, absolutely. It's my pleasure. Before we proceed, let me give you some background to the timing. I planned to record this episode a couple of weeks ago as the local Catholic cardinal in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina served a mass for Bleiburg victims executed by the Yugoslav partisans at the end of the World War II. Most of those killed were pro-Nazi militants executed by the Yugoslavian communist regime. In April and May of 1945, members of pro-Nazi militias from various parts of Yugoslavia fled towards Austria with their family members. They were to surrender to British forces at Bleiburg, but the British army extradited them to communist forces, and many of the prisoners were executed without trial. So a large event to commemorate the victims is now annually held in Bleiburg. The Bleiburg rally this year has been canceled due to the coronavirus pandemic. Usually, or rather in the past, the visitors were displaying the Nazi symbols and those of Ustasha movement, which killed Jews, Serb, Roma, people and others during World War II in the independent state of Croatia. So that decision to hold Mass in Sarajevo this year as one of the two replacement events in the first place prompted an avalanche of criticism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, including a condemnation from the Israeli and the US embassies. It was condemned by Bosnia's Serbian Orthodox Church, the Jewish and Muslim communities, and several anti-fascist organizations. The World Jewish Congress condemned the plans. It said that for the past 24 years, the Bleiburg remembrance events have been, quote, used to glorify individuals who supported or were actively involved in the activities of a regime which had executed hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children only because of their ethnic or religious identity. Finally, the Mass was held in Sarajevo. 20 people attended the service in the Sarajevo Cathedral. In the opposition of the event, thousands of protesters with masks on their faces due to the pandemic marched through Sarajevo. They thought and they found that it was dangerous that this was a dangerous attempt to rehabilitate the Nazi collaborators, referring to Croatia's Ustasha's militias, because in the closing months of World War II, the Ustasha militia implemented a brutal terror campaign in Sarajevo, and the Croatian forces under the Nazi allied Ustasha regime oversaw the Holocaust in Sarajevo. So referring to the anti-fascist protest, Jakub Finci of the local Jewish community said that Bosnia and especially Sarajevo have always been anti-fascist, that Sarajevo has been anti-fascist town, both between 1941, as he said, and 45, and again, between 92 and 95, we have always been victims of fascism, of different types of Nazis. That is why the average person is strongly opposing this, in the words of Jakub Finci of the local Jewish community. So it was this anti-fascist heritage of the city which has inspired me, and actually it brings me back to the beginning, or rather the focus of this episode, which is the Sarajevo Haggadah, as a symbol not only of long Jewish presence in Sarajevo and as one of the many parts of a city's multicultural heritage, but also of course, it is Sarajevo Haggadah is a ritual text of Jewish identity. It's a priceless work of art, and it's an incredible source of diverse history. Can you please, let's dive in. Can you describe us briefly Dervis Korkut's family background, his life until World War II, and also you've done extensive archival research. Let's get a feeling a little bit about this man of extraordinary courage, but also let's understand the environment in which he both grew up and which kind of led to his educational formation as well.
So basically, the Korkuts are one of the most famous families in Bosnia, and Dervish family, and his grandfather and father and so on, they all originate from Travnik in central Bosnia, and for almost 150 years they have been religiously educated scholars, and for generations the Korkuts were the main muftis of Travnik. And interestingly enough, Dervis Korkut himself was the last mufti in Travnik until that the muftiate office was abolished in the 1930s. So basically, he had a large family background, a large family tradition in scholarly work, in specifically religious and Oriental studies. And this can also be seen from his brothers. Korkut's brother is very famous, Besim Korkut, because he was one of his translation of the Quran was one of the most famous, and it's still being used today. His other brother was a very famous journalist and politician, Sarajevo Korkut. So his entire family was a very renowned family from central Bosnia, which also became part of the scholarly establishment of Sarajevo, especially between the two world wars. So the Korkuts, which I mentioned in religious and public life in the interwar period in Yugoslavia, are mainly these three brothers. His father himself, Korkut's father, was also part of the Ulama Majlis, which is like the governing body of the Islamic community in Bosnia. So Dervish had a really good educational and religious background his entire life. So he was educated and went after finishing school and the first gymnasium here in Sarajevo. He went to Istanbul where he studied theology, came back to Sarajevo and continued living here in Sarajevo.
So if we fast forward to Sarajevo in 1941, so we know the Nazi military rolled into Sarajevo as Bosnia became absorbed into the Nazi puppet state of Croatia. And there were rumors at the time that Hitler had a plan for a museum of an extinct race. And the country was also to be cleansed of Jews. So where is Dervis Korkut at the time? What is going on with Haggadah?
So basically, before the Second World War, before the Holocaust, Korkut is working in the National Museum in Sarajevo. Between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, Korkut had a variety of different jobs which he did. Mainly, they were related to scholarly and bit to politics, a bit to scholarly work and in academic studies and things like that. And prior to the breakout of World War II, he was working as a chief librarian and the creator of the National Museum in Sarajevo. Mm-hmm. So in 1940, when 1940, just like in the whole of Europe, in Yugoslavia, there was a rise in anti-Semitism, mm-hmm. And there was this outbreak of anti-Jewish sentiment, of conspiracy theories and things like that. And this slowly also became part of the narrative in Sarajevo. So Korkut at that time, since he had a very good connections, just like many other Bosniak elites in the country, they had very good connections with the Jewish community. Korkut at that time wrote in 1940 an article in an edited volume in Belgrade. His article was called "Anti-Semitism is Foreign to the Muslims of Bosnia," in which he laid out the problem of the rising anti-Semitism in Bosnia at that time. So publishing this in 1940 at that time, with Belgrade being exclusively anti-Semitic and so on, with the Cvetković Maček government in power. It was a very brave thing at the time to publish in Belgrade. In 1941, when Yugoslavia was occupied by the Nazi Germans, and when basically Yugoslavia was divided into two countries, into the independent state of Croatia and into Nedic's puppet government, Korkut was working in the museum. He had a very good relationship with his boss, with his director called Jozo Petrović, who was a Bosnian Croat, and who had very good relations with the Italian government at the time. So he wasn't touched by the Nazi Germans or by the Ustasha government because he had a very good relation with the Italians. So one day in 1941, they heard, one day during the Second World War, they got information that the Nazi German general was going to come to the museum to visit. So when he came there, he was giving a tour of the museum. He had the tour, and then he said, "Okay, now the tour is over. Can you give me Haggadah?" And since Korkut predicted that this general was going to ask for the Haggadah, since everybody was talking about the Haggadah between the two world wars and so on, it was quite famous. Korkut, right before the general came, he and Jozo Petrović, he actually told Jozo Petrović, the director, let's go and try and save the Haggadah. And Petrović in the beginning was hesitant, but then Korkut said, don't worry about, I'll take care of this. Basically, Jozo Petrović knew what Korkut was going to do, but Korkut took the whole thing into his own hands. So he took the Haggadah from the safe in the basement, and he hid it in his clothes. So when the general in the end asked for the Haggadah, Korkut basically said, this morning there were some German officers who came and put the Haggadah away. So the German general replied, can you give me their names? And he said, well, it's not my position to ask for a German officer's name. So this whole narrative about the Haggadah is something which is part of the oral history. So there's no written record of how this whole conversation went. This is something which has been generally accepted by people and which has been told for so many times. The Haggadah, we don't know what happened with the Haggadah later on. This is again part of the oral history. So there are several versions of what really happened. In one case, apparently Korkut, what we do know actually is that Korkut brought the Haggadah to his home that day. Right. This is something which has been confirmed by his wife, passed away in 2013. So we do know that the Haggadah was brought back to his home in Sarajevo, in the old town. And then later on, apparently, Korkut gave the Haggadah to a friend, to an imam, who was either an imam in Mountain Vlašić, Bosnia, near Travnik, where Korkut was born, or in another case, it was on Mountain Treskavica, where he also had a friend who was an imam. So we don't really know what happened, who Korkut gave this to, because Korkut talked very little about so many things in his life. What we do know is that he brought this Haggadah home and that he gave it back to the museum several years later when the war ended. So what we do know is that Korkut took it out of the museum and he brought it back inside. What happened in between, we don't have those details.
Right, and there's also that other theory, which Jakub Finci, who is the leader of the local Jewish community and believes, it's a theory developed by the former head of the Library of the National Museum, Kemal Bakrišić, and that is that the Haggadah was actually, that it spent the entire war in the museum, right? Hidden among hundreds of thousands of other books in the museum library. So there's that theory as well. And as you say, the exact details of his smuggling and preservation of Haggadah are unclear. But then we come to unfortunate part of his post-war fate. After the war, Dervis Korkut, who by this point we know is a proven anti-fascist, gets to the court for allegedly cooperating with the fascists. And then he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. So can you just tell us a little bit more about why this was a political trial and the circumstances of how and why it happened?
Okay, so firstly, let me just say that Korkut's saving of the Haggadah was not the only thing he did during the Second World War. Most importantly, he saved at least one Jewish life, saving a Jewish teenager called Mira Papo, who basically, I mean, one day during the Second World War, one of his friends came across a Jewish girl who he knew from before, and who was a part of the partisan movement. And then once their group was destroyed by the Germans, she managed to survive. She came back to the city. She was sleeping in the park, and Korkut's friend found her, took her to Korkut, and after a brief discussion for a few minutes, Korkut took her, told her that from now on she is going to be known as Amira, and that she is going to be represented as his wife's distant cousin from Kosovo, from Jakovo, and that she shouldn't talk to anybody in Bosnian language at all. So she was getting Muslim clothes, and she lived in his family for several months until Korkut and his friends managed to get illegal documents and send her to southern Bosnia, to Herzegovina, which was under the Italian control. And from there, she was able to save herself and join the partisans again. So that's one case. And another case, Korkut saved a number of manuscripts from the Kajon family in Sarajevo. His very good friend, Vito Kajon, was a very famous publisher and a collectioner in Sarajevo, and he knew that he was going to be sent to Jasenovac, to one of the death camps. He came to Dervish and he gave him a huge box of Jewish manuscripts. They told him, this is for you in amanet, so for safekeeping. Korkut took those manuscripts and he intentionally, falsely registered them in the museum as the Turkish documents of family Kapitanovic. So basically, whenever somebody would be looking for these documents in a catalog, they wouldn't find any Jewish manuscripts. They would find Kapitanovic family Turkish documents. But he saved this as well. He also took part in protecting the Roma Muslim population in the Second World War. When very early on in 1941, the Roma population was targeted by the Ustasha, he and several other people drafted a written response to the Ustasha government, stating that they shouldn't and they can't prosecute the Romas on racial grounds. So he had a variety of activities which we know of, and I'm sure that there were many more which he did, which are not registered anywhere else. Which he protected all kinds of endangered minorities there, including Muslim refugees from Eastern Bosnia, came from Visegrad, Foča, and so on, who were refugees in Sarajevo. He organized together with other non-political Muslim elites in Sarajevo a huge humanitarian campaign to give them refuge. After the Second World War, Second World War, the communist government arrested Korkut in 1947 for cooperation with the fascists. Now, in order to understand why he was arrested, we need to know that Korkut was a person who always disagreed with the government. So throughout his whole entire life, he always said what he thought. He always criticized the government or gave his opinion. He didn't really care about the remedies.
Ideology of the moment, right?
No, he didn't care about it. He showed that in 1920s when he was working in Belgrade at the Ministry of Religious Affairs. At that time, the sub-radical party led by Dr Karcic, they kicked him out from the ministry. Later on, he criticized the Ustaša government in the Second World War for trying to interfere in Muslim relations inside the Islamic community. I mean, they wanted to send him to Jasenovac. He went into hiding the last few months of the war with his whole entire family. And the order for him to go to Zagreb came directly from Ante Pavelić, from the leader. So you can see a this really high level interest in getting rid of Korkut. Because his activities, this was some sort of non-violent resistance, giving to all ideas that he was against. So after the Second World War, of course, the communist government came. He was supportive of the partisans, definitely. But after the communist government was set up, he didn't agree with certain things the communist government did. Mainly, this was interference in religious affairs of the Islamic community. Most importantly, he did not agree with the attempt to destroy the old town in Sarajevo, because there were many plans of communists to build a new, bigger, better, modern Sarajevo. And he multiple times told, and this is what his wife actually said it, that he was telling his brothers at that time that these people have no idea about cultural heritage, and his brother Basim was telling him to be much more wise, wise, not to talk too much against the government and so on. He unfortunately did not listen. He raised his opinion against it and so on. And one of his biggest, most fatal mistakes was meeting up with the British consul in Sarajevo at the time. And he asked the British consul for British interference in Yugoslavia in order to provide international protection for Muslims in Yugoslavia, something similar to the Saint-Germain minority treaty from 1919, which was protection of Muslim rights in the first Yugoslavia after the First World War. So his meeting with the British consul was basically the final decision by the communists to get rid of him. The easiest way you could get rid of somebody in that time, 2 years after the Second World War, was just to accuse them of cooperating with the Nazis. That's what they did. They accused him and several other high-ranking Russian intellectuals for cooperation with the Nazis, for a variety of different things, but they were all individually sentenced for their own individual crimes. I think the biggest Korkut was hardest hit due to the fact that at the time he had two little children at the time. So his whole entire property was confiscated from Sarajevo. His wife at the time with his 2 kids had to leave Sarajevo and go to live with her family in Kosovo. At that time, his youngest daughter dies from a disease in Kosovo. Comes out after 8 years from a hard labor prison in Zenside in Foch, broken. And I got the archives from the prison, and even in the prison, he did not change his ideas, and the prison director basically wrote that
he was very lazy, right? I read in your book.
They accused him of being lazy, but at that time he was an elder man at the time, quite old, and but they accused him of still talking to certain political opponents and dissidents in the prison, including Jozo Petrovic, the first director. So the 2 people who were most important in saving the Haggadah were both sent to prison for cooperation with the enemy. He comes out from prison in the 1950s, and he gets a job again at a new museum, the Sarajevo City Museum. And that's where he continues working, even though he already has enough years of work and age to go into retirement. He continues to work basically, and he worked until his last days. And he died in 1969. So basically, he has a really fascinating life. And wasn't for Mira Papo, who survived the Second World War, who went to Israel to live.
That's fascinating.
In 1994, she writes a letter to Yad Vashem about the whole entire story. If it wasn't for Mira Papo writing the letter, believe me, it would be really hard to prove most of these things, because I can just imagine how many other things Korkut and many other Korkuts in Sarajevo at that time did.
And Mira Papo actually also wrote that letter because she felt guilty for not being able to participate at the trial of Dervis Korkut. So it's kind of a good karma that came back, at least to Dervis Korkut's daughter Lamia, who actually in 1999, thanks to that document from Yad Vashem, was able to get her family out of the refugee camp from Macedonia after they escaped Kosovo, and then they went to Israel and then to Canada. So it was just getting more fascinating the more I read, but there is that legacy of Dervis Korkut that remained kind of consistent with his appreciation for not just interfaith harmony, but for cultural heritage and protection of minorities, as you touched upon as well. So then what happened to not forget Sarajevo Haggadah, which is kind of the main point of the story as well. What happened with the Haggadah during the last war, Hikmet, between 92 and 95? It was saved again, right?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, I just want to set the record straight. After the Second World War, nobody mentioned Korkut saving the Haggadah, at least officially. So people were talking about it, but in the history of the museum and written documents, Korkut was the enemy of the state. He was a collaborator. He was accused as a collaborator. So the whole narrative about the Haggadah changed. So if they talked about it officially, they would say employees of the museum saved the Haggadah. Right up to the war in 1990s. So in 1982, the National Museum was a few hundred meters away from the Serbian army occupied part of Sarajevo called Vrbavica, which was right across the Mijacka River. And from there, they were bombarding the whole entire town, of course, because the whole city was under siege. The museum as well was being bombarded. And, all of these cultural, institutions being burned down intentionally, such as the Oriental Institute, the National Library, and so on. So basically, the National Museum was also endangered by the Bosnian Serb army. And at that time, a couple of people under the leadership of a Bosnian historian called Enver Imamovic, they entered the museum and they broke the safe and they took out the Haggadah and took it to the central bank, which had a huge, really, a good safe vault, where they kept the Haggadah during the whole entire war. Now, since nobody, of course, the Haggadah is like the most, it's actually the most valuable treasure of Sarajevo. And nobody knew what happened with it. They never publicly said that they took it out from the museum, that they sent it to the central bank and so on. Of course, due to the fact that you had many people who would love to take it from there and sell it in the black market and so on. Since at that time in Sarajevo, we had a bunch of different, both local and international criminal gangs, including members of the United Nations here who were very active in the black market. So it was very, plus members of different secret services and so on. It was very possible for them to take it out from Sarajevo. So during the war in 1994, the Serbian, actually one Serbian journalist manages to get a story in American newspaper saying that the Bosnian government sold the Haggadah to the Iranians for military weapons for the Bosnian army. I think this was published in a major American newspaper, and of course this created a backlash against the Bosnian government. So in 1995, the Bosnian government decided to pass over to take out the Haggadah and show it in front of CNN, BBC, and all other different major networks. There's a very good documentary made about this whole wartime saving of the Haggadah.
Yes, I saw it. It's beautifully done. I recommend everybody. It's available on YouTube and it's 32 minutes long, but it's beautifully done. Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's the story of the Haggadah during the war, the last war.
And today the Haggadah is in Sarajevo and it's in the National Museum, right?
Yes.
Right.
And it's available two times a week. Going to visit it, so it's not available every day.
And as we said in the first part of the podcast, it is part of both the Bosnia's national heritage and UNESCO's World Register. So I do want now, Hikmet, to ask you, considering your expertise as well, a little bit about the Jewish experience in Bosnia and Herzegovina during their different epochs of the country's history. Jakub Finci, who is the leader of the local Bosnian Jewish community, said simply, the fact that anti-Semitism is not expressed in Bosnia and Herzegovina is a rarity for 21st century Europe, because we see that anti-Semitism and right-wing currents and political parties are slowly taking over and returning to where they have not been for a long time, as he said. So tell us a little bit more about the Jewish experience in Bosnia. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
So basically, the first Jews who came to Bosnia, at the time Ottoman Bosnia, were the Sephardic Jews who were kicked out together with Muslims. Reconquista of Spain. They came to the Ottoman lands, most notably to Thessaloniki and to Sarajevo. So the Ottoman Sultan at that time decided to, provide an opportunity for the Sephardic Jews to come and to settle the empire. So that was the first time that the Sephardic Jews came to Sarajevo. And once they came to Sarajevo, they were given by the local governor at the time and by the Gazi Vakov, the endowment. They were given a strip of land in the old town to build their synagogue, the first synagogue. And the synagogue was built by the Vakov of the Gazi So basically, the idea of interfaith tolerance between Muslims and Jews in this part of the country, but also in the whole entire region, has much to do with the Ottoman Empire's presence in the time. So we're talking about a period when you had vast programs of Jews in Western Europe, in Russian territories, and so on. At the time, you didn't have that in Sarajevo and in most parts of the Ottoman Empire. So that's the reason why we had such a long legacy of, and actually the Jews of Bosnia became part of everyday life. So a period of time when you had several different newspapers being published in Bosnia at that time, where really good, amazing cooperation of people in major cities, Muslims and Jews alike, living together, working together, cooperating, up businesses together, and so on and so forth. Actually, the first time, the first time the Jewish population was totally destroyed and eliminated was during the Second World War. Mm-hmm. So we did not have. This is what I really like to always stress out. There were no ghettos for Jews in Bosnia at that time. Yeah. There were no programs for Jews in Bosnia at all. So there were no ghettos, there were no programs, and people were basically living together with each other. And that's one of the most, the best examples of the tolerance. And this is something which Korkut talks about in 1940, trying to remind the people at that time in the rise of anti-Semitism that these are people who have been living with us all entire, centuries, basically.
Yeah. I read, before you continue, I read a very interesting paper. I can't remember, do you quote it, from Joanna Rock, Sarajevo and the Sarajevo Sephardim. It was published, I think, in 2018. She's from Humboldt University in Berlin, and she describes kind of, starting from the Ottoman Sarajevo, how rabbis served as lawyers for Jews, and also that some Sephardi Jews sometimes turned to Muslim Sharia courts at the time. That in 1581, a Jewish neighborhood in Sarajevo had its own synagogue, and in 1630, the still existing old Jewish cemetery was probably established, according to her paper. And absolutely, as you said, and she mentions, movement in and out of the Jewish neighborhood was unrestricted. So it was not a ghetto, as you said, and they had their schools too, which was how they were able to preserve their Ladino language for quite a while, right? So, and then we know from papers like this one and from researchers that most Sephardim were merchants, but many of them were, like you said, doctors, pharmacists. They were very integrated in the public life. You said, mentioned it was in World War II, pretty much. Was it 10% of Sarajevo that was Jewish? From what I have gathered, it was 10,000 people. And then during World War II, more than 80% of Yugoslav Jews in Yugoslavia, 82,500 people, were killed from John Rock's paper that I found out. So it was very high toll in that sense, right?
Actually, so you have, at that time, Yugoslavia is divided into two countries. You have Nedic Serbia, which is under Nazi government control, and on the other side, you have this independent state of Croatia, which is a very autonomous area, ruled by the Croatian families. Serbia becomes the first country to proclaim itself Judenfrei, free of Jews, right after Estonia. So there was not a single Jew left in Serbia at that time. And this is something which Christopher Browning wrote about his work on Holocaust in Serbia. Most of these Jews were killed in several execution points and camps, but also sent off to Nazi Germany. In the independent state of Croatia, you had a much more brutal campaign in the sense that the Ustaša were much more brutal in some cases than the Nazis themselves, and especially brutal to the Serbian victims and to the Jewish and the Roma victims. The Jewish victims were firstly brought to Jasenovac, then there was a filter or selection of sort, and they were sent off to Auschwitz for their execution. So that's why the number of the mortality rate of the Jews will high in this part of yeah. But at the same time, you had a lot of cases of Jews being saved by their neighbors, by their friends, and so on, and they were being always sent down south towards Italian-controlled territories, which were much more, let's say, lenient toward, you could easily pass through Italian soldiers and parties and so on. Much more easier. It's easier to hide and so on. And in the end, most of these Yugoslav Jews ended in these areas or in Albania.
Yeah.
So that's one of the most important things. Albania is one of the rare countries in Europe which had a larger Jewish population after the war than before the war.
Yeah.
More people came to hide there. And since at that time Kosovo was part of Albania, it was much more easier to go through Bosnia, Sanjak, South Serbia to get over to Kosovo, and from there down towards Tirana and whatever, towards parts of Albania. So it was a much more complex case. It's quite difficult to explain all these parts in such a short time, but definitely there were. It's a very sad story of how the Jewish population of Yugoslavia and then of Bosnia, how it was eliminated in the Second World War, but also there are many positive aspects of how neighbors, their friends, colleagues, family, unknown people like Korkut helping Mira Papo, and you have so many other cases of families who, unfortunately, quite late did we find out about these cases. Like Hagaddah family, like the Korkut family, like many others. Some of them, even to this day, are getting recognitions by as righteous among nations. Korkut got it. Korkut got it in 1984, so almost years after he died, and thanks to Mira Papo's letter, so you had many cases of people who, helped out, saved family members, but later on could not talk about it, or did not want to talk about it, or basically were killed in other cases during Allied bombardments or massacres, and so on.
There's so much to unpack here, like you say. I mean, Albania, as you said, was the only, from what I read, European nation to emerge from the Holocaust with a larger Jewish population. I think it's interesting to at least mention another unique aspect of this Albanian code of law was Besa, right? Which meant protecting one's guests. So when Albanians who follow this Besa what they felt was they were hosting Jews, I mean, they were willing to do anything from my research, including risking their own lives to protect them. So that rescue and survival of approximately 2,000 Jews by Albanians has, for decades, as you mentioned, remained unknown. And you're probably aware, in similar light, Eli Tauber, who wanted and had different initiatives to make sure that these efforts are kind of known. He began by trying to document the stories of people who had already been recognized by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial organization known in Israel as Righteous Among the Nation, for their help. But then he was trying to track down the relatives and those who could offer photographs and stories precisely to keep the new documentation. And in 2007, now I don't know what's going on with that project right now, he had made that nationwide appeal to find 100 more cases of people who had kind of saved each other. So as you mentioned, there was really this long tradition of preserving each other as beyond religion or ethnicity or nationality. In that light, and I'm sure you participated in that conference last November, in November 2019, Bosnia's Jews and Muslims celebrated and marked the bicentenary of the rescue. It was the Purim of Sarajevo, right? And there was a big international conference in Sarajevo at the time, because in 1819, the governor of Bosnia, just to tell shortly our listeners, that was under the Ottoman rule at the time, Rushdie Pasha detained and threatened to kill several Jews in case the Jewish community refused to pay a large ransom. But it was thanks to the prominent people of Sarajevo that a dozen Jews were saved, right? And so then in November again, there even the Hussein Efendi Kavazovic, who is the leader of official Islamic community, was present at the conference, and he stated, amid the ever-rising evil of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we are renewing our pledge that we will remain good neighbors who will watch over each other as we did in the past. So that leads me back to that question I asked you 2 minutes ago. Considering the political conjuncture, and you are you're an expert on far right in Europe and everything that's been going on as well. Why is it even more important to keep remembering these things, to put Dervis Korkut's place back in our history, back to where it belongs, and to keep kind of talking about these stories in this moment of time and history?
So, firstly, the rise of the far right in Europe and throughout the world is in line with the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia at the same time. So these two things go together. The second thing is that cases such as the Bosnian genocide, for example, are an inspiration for right-wing movements throughout the world, such as that, as in the case of, Breivik, which we saw several years ago, and now in Christchurch in New Zealand and so on. So my argument is that why don't we make stories such as Dervis Korkut an inspiration for people to fight against, right? So we have so many positive stories which we can tell, but which haven't been told. My next project, I hope, will be on the Mufti of Tuzla, Kurt, who saved several thousand Serbs in the Second World War, defying the Ustaša regime at the time in Tuzla. So we have so many positive aspects of people who are virtually unknown in Western or English language literature, academia, and so on and so forth. And definitely these stories can be used as a contra-narrative to the ongoing, right now, rising narrative of far-right movements throughout the world. So using the story of how, and basically this is the narrative which Karcic and Mladic used in the 1990s, saying that minorities, people of different faith, religion, ethnic background can't live together. These are stories which show that people can live together. Small group of fascists who are trying to divide up and polarize the societies. So, there are so many Korkuts out there who are maybe not to that extent stubborn as Dervish was, but who are defying, authorities, who are targeting minorities, who are trying to kill and murder people just based on the fact that they have a different name and religion.
Absolutely. And that is why I chose to make this episode on Sarajevo Haggadah as kind of the center and the focus, but it's also about the themes related to it. That said, Hikmet, is there anything that you want to share before I take you to I'm not going to say more fun part of the podcast, but I really appreciate the professionalism and that approach that you take in your academic work as well. And I'm very excited about the new one that you now announced as well. Are you, considering that you're also author of Islamophobia report and you do all sorts of stuff in Holocaust studies, are you optimistic about what's happening politically in Europe and the world in terms of the rise of authoritarianism, or can I dare to say rise of fascism, or are we naive to mention the rise of fascism or return of fascism? Is it back? What is your opinion on that political conjuncture globally right now?
Globally, I think we're in a very bad place. I mean, that's the awful truth. But I think that's even with the rise of Orban and all these other cases, we still have a critical mass which is there, which can point fingers and say that this is wrong. And as long as we have that critical mass, then there is definitely hope for a better future. What is definitely here also shown is that Europe itself cannot deal with these issues by its own on itself, so it definitely needs help from states and to preserve the peace in Europe, and especially in the Balkans, in this part of the Balkans. This area has always been some sort of playground for different empires and different ideologies and so on and so forth. So we are always living in these interesting times throughout our whole life, and what we can definitely see is that the next couple of years will definitely be much more interesting for us.
I urge everybody and anybody who has interest in Holocaust studies in the Balkans and really Islamophobia or genocide studies to follow Dr. Hikmet Karcic. He's present online as well. Thank you, Hikmet, so much for your time. I do want now to bring you to something that I called 5 sweet questions, which is unrelated to your professional expertise, but which allows our listeners to get to know you just a little bit more. So here are the 5 questions for you. First one is, once the current global pandemic is over, and I don't know I know what the situation in Bosnia is right now. The borders are opening, the cases are rising like everywhere, but in general, once it's over, is there something that you would not want to forget from this period?
I have no idea actually. This pandemic came actually as a blessing, because I've been able to do so much academic work at home. So I'm going to definitely miss some parts of the pandemic.
Some time, right? You got more time to do more work.
Yes.
So, okay, next question. Which of your personality traits do you think has been the most useful? Like, not the best, but what do you think was the most useful part of your personality?
I have no idea. Seriously.
You see, it's so amazing that to ask these questions to, I guess. Look, I'm like, it allows you to think, right?
Yeah. I never thought about it actually.
Right. Are you, what was it? Are you disciplined or patient, impatient, determined, assertive, curious? What do you think throughout your...
No, I'm very impatient and I'm very determined. So I'm a Capricorn in the horoscope. So basically, I just like to get things done. So I hate having some things not finished. Just like to, and I want to finish things which no one else has done. So that's actually how I came to do corporate. Nobody else was doing it. Everybody was talking about the story, and I decided, why shouldn't I write about this? So and it became really good, actually, very good decision to do so.
Oh, absolutely. You see, I should have asked that at the beginning. What made you do this?
Well, I mean, imagine I had to go to like 5 different archives.
Yeah.
These are archives where people usually are not very helpful in this case. And some archives are gone. That was most fascinating. Like, I have records of documents in some archives which exist, which are related to Korkut. You go there, they're not there anymore. Physically, they're not. Because, you know, war, post-war period, people getting in and out of archives, taking documents out, taking them home, bringing them back, buying documents and things like that. So it was really hard, you know, to put this mosaic together. And plus, one more thing, when Korkut was arrested in 1947, his whole entire library was taken away. His whole entire archive was taken away. To make things worse, all the things which he managed to save and to collect after he came out from prison was burned down by the Serbian army in Grbavica in 1992. So I started off with nothing, you know, basically. I contacted the family, you know, they were very helpful, and talked, but they really had not, even the photographs were very rare, you know. So, you know, it was definitely a difficult task to do. It's something which, you know, since I'm quite determined, I really wanted to do it. Because, I mean, if this was easy, somebody would have done it so far. I mean, 25 years ago, somebody would have done it, you know. Just like other books were being written 25 years ago. But since nobody did it, I figured that, you know, it's probably very difficult to write it. And in the end, it's not a large book, it's quite small. But I hope that over time, we'll be able to gather more and more archival resources and materials, and then just expand the book further.
Before I get to the fourth question, and thank you for mentioning that, where can people find the book? Can they buy it online? I'm sure there are a lot of people from the United States and around the world who would like to read it, and it's written in English as well. So where is it available right now?
Currently, it's available through the publishing house in Sarajevo called Al-Kalam on their website. We're going to try and put it on Amazon and on.
Okay, great. So there is a possibility of getting it through alkalam.ba.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great. Okay, so next question. When you have 30 minutes of free time that you could control, how do you pass the free time when you're not working?
I smoke hookah.
Okay. So that in Sarajevo, there is a whole street, from what I remember now, of new stores popping up, but you do it at home?
I'm much more for the home environment. You know, I have my own home.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Especially at the time of pandemic. Personally, I thought it was crazy to read that they're opening the stores. But anyway, fourth question: what skill or craft would you like to master?
I always wanted to play some sort of instrument, and we're, you know, as family, we're totally anti-talent for any sort of, you know, music. So.
But I do want to mention the Karcic family. This stays in the digital history. It is one of the most renowned in terms of Dr. Karcic, and who is Hikmet's father, and Harun Karcic and Hamza Karcic, very prolific intellectuals of the contemporary Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I always learn from them whatever I do. So I wanted that to be on the record as well. Last question, Hikmet. Are any of your friends completely opposite to you, or are most of them similar to you?
All of my friends are totally opposite to me. Totally.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I get very different responses of people. And how do you appreciate the differences? How does it work?
Oh, it's quite good because, you know, they mostly are interested in what I'm doing, but I don't think they ever read any of my stuff. So, because I usually bore them, you know, talking about, you know, all of these different things, and it's quite funny, you know, hanging out with them. Anyway, you know, the culture in Sarajevo, the coffee culture, things like that. So, you know, we drink like 10 different coffees per day in Sarajevo, and so. And yeah, but most of my friends come from high school, from faculty.
All right. Okay, well, there you have it. Now you know where to get the book. Now you know whom you need to Google when you need to learn something. So again, thank you so much for joining us, Dignified Resilience, and for sharing this expertise and for doing it, like I say, because I think that by producing this book, you, in an official manner, made your contribution towards putting Dervis Korkut's place in our history towards where it belongs. So that said, to everybody else, Stay well, hold tight to those you love, and stay tuned for more conversations from people from all over the globe.